Hi, I'm Karen Spurtzel at the Maryland Sheep and Wool 2021 Virtual Festival. We're going to be talking to Janet Garman, who is most recently the author of Natural Dyes on Wool, and she runs Timber Creek Farm, and which is where she lives. She raises sheep, goats, chickens, ducks, and other species, um, and enjoys sharing what she loves and motivating and encouraging other homesteaders. She's written several books filled with the experiences and skills that um, filled her days. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
How did you become interested in natural dyeing?
I have a friend who wrote a book about 10 years ago. That was my first introduction to it. And I never thought about it. I didn't even know it existed at that point. And I was hooked from the very, very beginning. I was able to get my start by following the ideas that she presented in her book. And she's a gardener primarily. So it was very much focused on garden dyes, flowers and things that you would be growing in your backyard. After that, I started to wonder about forage dyes more and more, and that really appeals to me. So I got very interested in products or plants that you can find out in nature.
So, what's the difference then between natural dyeing and other acid dyeing?
The difference is just, I mean, they're both going to give you color on wool, or, you know, if you're into cottons or whatever. So natural dyeing actually works best on wool, as opposed to natural dyeing on cotton is a bit more involved of a process. It's not the easiest thing to do, in my opinion. But I'm sure there are people who would disagree with that. But I think that natural dyeing and wool are just made to go together. Acid dyeing is a great way to get very vibrant colors and to also be able to replicate those colors much more closely. When you're working with natural dyes, especially foraged products, as opposed to purchasing dye stuffs, you're dealing with weather conditions, time of year, any other environmental factors will vary the results you get. So, you know, you could try your pokeberry one year and it was a dry summer and you won't get the vibrancy that you will on a rainier summer with the same plant giving you the pokeberries. So
when you talk about foraging versus the garden,
mm-hmm.
What do you forage for, and where could somebody like me,
Mm-hmm.
I live on a teeny little tenth of an acre.
Yep.
Where can you go and forage for things that would make a nice natural dye?
Right. Well, you know, the first one I would recommend to you is dandelions, because we all have dandelions, you know,
I have lots of them.
whether we want them or not. I actually ask my husband now before the yard gets cut to let me go out and gather up the dandelions, because I just save them. You dry them and they work just as well as they would if you had them fresh. So, you know, you don't have to get a large amount at once. You just have to be consistent. Like when you see a patch of dandelions, grab the heads of them. I'm kind of like always on the lookout for things that might work. Purple dead nettle is a very invasive weed that a lot of us have in our yards. That can make a great spring green color, not a spring green as in bright green,
Mhm.
but a soft green. And it's a weed, you know, it's like out there, it's everywhere right now. And you need about a bucket full to do a 100-gram skein of yarn. So it's easy to find. Acorns is another one that's easy to find in the fall when your oak trees are dropping. And black walnuts, maybe you don't have a black walnut tree, but if your neighbor does, they probably would not mind you picking up a bucket full of black walnuts and taking them out of their yard. So there's quite a few things like that that you can just find easily And then of course, there's other things. You can use oak bark, other kinds of tree bark, apple tree bark. If you have a lot of limbs fall from an apple tree, you could, save them and grind them up or chop them up or some form of getting them into a dye pot and follow the directions for apple bark dye.
So what color does the bark?
It's a very pale yellow.
Oh,
It's pretty, kind of a tannish yellow. It's a nice neutral.
now is natural dyeing something a new dyer, somebody who's never dyed before, can take up? Or should they start maybe with acid dyeing and move over towards?
I think that natural dyeing is very rewarding for the newcomer to the dye world because you can just find something in nature. You don't have to spend a lot of money, to get dye stuffs. You can just go out in your yard and gather up some materials and just come out with a rewarding color. Most of the things that I promote for people that are starting in the forage dyes are the readily available ones that we often look at as weeds, like I mentioned. And then of course, pokeberry in the summer. It's, not a berry that we want to eat, but we can get some beautiful reds and pinks out of that berry. So onion skin is another one that is super easy because it's already loaded with tannins. So you don't have to necessarily even buy any alum or other mordant material to get your yarn ready. You just use your onion skins and your yarn and you've got a great, really nice golden yellow.
So is there a particular plant that you use that's particularly interesting in that you can get different colors with different mordants?
One that I really like, I consider it what I call a kitchen dye, is black bean. It's a little bit fugitive in that the color will change over time, but I have samples that are 2 years old and they're still very close to what I started out with. And you don't waste the beans because you soak beans before you cook them anyway. And so you're basically just using that liquid that comes from soaking the beans to dye your yarn. So that one is fun because if you add some washing soda to it, it changes it to green. So you kind of have this grayish blue, and then you add a little bit of the soda ash, and it brightens it up, and it's really fun. So I love those kind of experiments of the modifiers.
Is that how you learn different things, by just playing around?
I am a little bit of a mad scientist in the dye pots. I will admit that. But I do try to educate myself first before, just dumping things in. And with your modifiers, you're using such a small amount. And I'm not a production dyer. So, I'm doing maybe 500, 600 grams of wool at a time. I might come out with enough that you could make a small garment of 5 or 6 skeins of yarn. I don't have any desire to be a production dyer where I'm doing dye lots. Like my dye lots are very small. So that gives me opportunity to play around more because I'm not taking that risk of, oh my gosh, I just came out with a totally different color than I wanted. And I've got 24 skeins of this color now and nobody wants it. So, when you're dealing with 1 or 2 skeins at a time, you're talking about a half a teaspoon to a teaspoon of your modifier, iron or washing soda, or even a little tiny bit of copper powder into the afterbath or right in the dye pot. And it's just amazing the difference that comes out. Even chalk dust will be a great modifier. Just regular
Really?
calcium carbonate. It's,
Huh.
yeah, really, really unique and interesting part of this whole world. is just the little slight differences you can do with a little bit of extra product. So I really
So
enjoy
how do
it.
you keep track? How do you keep track of what you're doing? You said you're a mad scientist in the dye pots.
I know. Well,
Um,
I've learned
how
over
do
the
you?
years that you really have to take good notes if you want to be able to get anywhere close to that result again, because I won't remember, and I'm going to pretty much guarantee that most people won't remember what they did when they go back 3 months later, pick up a skein of yarn and go, what? I know I did, I know this was dandelion, but I did something else to this, So that was part of the reason that I wrote this workbook to begin with, as I wanted to give people a starting point, give them the basics to get started. At least they'd have a foundation, because I tell people a lot of times it's creativity plus science. So I wrote this because there was no notebook or workbook out there that really fit the niche of a dyer's workbook. And so part of this book is also a formatted page where you can write down what you did. Maybe you got the green from Purple Dead Nettle following my instructions in the book, but maybe you didn't love it. And so you might have added a little bit of washing soda to see what happens. Or you might have just thought, let me see what happens if I put in a half a cup of vinegar, because these are all things that are not harmful to try. And you might not like that result either, but you can, at least you're not going to blow up your kitchen, so.
So speaking of the Mordants, are there some that you have found yourself gravitating to more than others? What kinds of Mordants do you use in natural dyeing?
I pretty much always use alum with cream of tartar. I find that's to my experimenting, that has been the most successful mordant for me. Some people that are into, using much more natural type of an approach will do like the rhubarb leaves or oak tannins. And those are all fine, but they're going to vary your color somewhat too. So, the same with iron. You can mordant in an iron solution, but it's not going to give you the same result. Alum will give you clearer results from that plant substance. And then there are other options for mordanting, but they're going to also affect the color.
Do you have any are there any colors in foraging? Are there any colors that you are really, really difficult to make? You really can't.
I think that people often get caught up in pokeberry because they cook it too much. It's when we're using acid dyes and then once they strike, right? Like the color's there, the water's clear, you're done. It's not so cut and dry with pokeberry, but you do have to keep an eye on it because it will hit its sweet spot. And if you go past that, you're going into the browns, muddy reds, and they're not as pretty. So they're not horrible, but you can't bring it back. Once you've gone too far, you've gone too far. So I always tell people with pokeberry, you've got to watch your temperature. You want to keep it well below the boiling point, like a very, very warm simmer, just that line, and not walk away. Like, don't walk away. Just that one is a watched pot. I will say that.
Are there colors that you can't make from foraged? Like you talked about making reds and from pokeberry and yellows and greens.
From actual foraged products, as opposed to, like, you're not referring to garden plants or food waste products. your foraged items are going to lean heavily into the browns, greens, grays, yellows, because that's what most chlorophyll filled plants will give you. And that's why you can modify them by, using some of the different modifier agents. But we don't have access to logwood trees in most of our country, definitely not here on the East Coast. So that beautiful logwood purple is amazing. And if you had logwood trees, you could definitely forage for that, because it's just chips. It's just, just chipping up the actual tree material. And you can adjust that to varying degrees too by how much you use. But not around here. If you get into some of the reds that you can buy from dye suppliers, from natural dye suppliers like the cochineal beetles, or the lac from the tree substance, those you can vary and get some, reds to purples, almost to, very, very dark, intense colors.
Are naturally dyed fibers stable?
Yeah, that's a really great question for natural dyes. They are, but you also have to understand that you're dealing with nature. So, if you do anything in a natural way, it's going to be sensitive to light. Let's just say that.
Okay.
Will it fade in a month? No, not if you've done the procedure correctly, which is part of the job of the mordant. Mordanting opens up the yarn or the fiber to accept the color better. And if you don't mordant properly, or the right amount of time or whatever, then you're going to have less of a light, fast product than if you were patient and did the mordant phase, didn't skip it. Because it's a chemical reaction, even though we're using natural substances. So, everything has to work together. And that, I have some pokeberry that is from when I first was starting with natural dyes 10 years ago. I have some pokeberry yarn, and it's faded. There's no question about it that it's faded. I liken it kind of to the garment industry does that like washed look, with the cottons. I kind of liken it to that, where it's not going to be as bright after 3 years of washing. It's not going to be as bright if it's a sweater you wear every day and it's constantly exposed to light. But, most of our clothing isn't treated that way. We wear it, we don't wear it for a couple weeks. Or we don't keep it out in the sun. We hang up our scarf with our coat, or we put our hat away. We don't leave it sitting out on a fence post. So, yes, there is definitely a fading factor, but there is with a lot of colors.
So along those lines, I lived in Afghanistan for a while, and I was friends with a rug merchant, and he always said that some of the older style rugs were vegetable dyed. That was his words. I think I would call them a natural dyed. And he always said those will not run.
Mm-hmm.
Is that whereas the commercially dyed would run? Is that?
Well, I don't have a lot of knowledge about the commercial dyes, since I don't work with them. If I rinse my yarn well after the dye process is over, they shouldn't run either. Like if there's no purple coming out of that logwood dye when I'm rinsing it, then it shouldn't come back and come out again later. It's in there. I'm only rinsing out the excess that hasn't combined with the yarn. So I'm not really sure if I'm giving you the
Yeah,
answer.
I was just curious because I remember him saying that,
Yeah,
and sometimes, yes, we were friends, but he was also selling me rugs.
right.
So
Well, I think that sometimes with indigo, you have that crocking effect happen. And you can avoid that by certain procedures while you're dyeing with indigo. But if you're mixing, like say you're mixing an indigo that has some crocking to it because it wasn't made correctly or whatever, I've had that happen. And then you mix that indigo with like a yellow to make a green, then your green is going to shed just like it would because it's not fixed properly. I think it's a method of using something called hide glue in the process, which can minimize that crocking and that, your hands turned blue because you were using indigo yarn.
yeah. Can you make a variegated yarn? Um,
It's
with
difficult. I know what you mean. It's a different procedure. So what happens is you won't get those speckly things like the beautiful acid dye variegateds and polka dot type, what do they call it? Like it's just like the sprinkling of colors and so beautiful.
I think it's
I've
speckled. Yeah.
Yeah, I've tried a few different methods to see if I can get anywhere close to that, and I really can't. It kind of just all diffuses into the yarn. It's not as distinct as it is with the acid dyes. They're so pretty that way. Um, but you can do a variegated by, well, my method of doing a variegated is to twist the skein very, very tightly, like a tie-dye kind of effect, and maybe even tie it off a little bit more and then put it in the dye. And when you take it out, the parts that were tied very, very tightly or very wound very tightly will not have as much dye in them. The other way I've done it is also to leave the dye stuff in the pot with the yarn. So wherever the yarn is kind of touching the mat, like say madder root, if it's touching the madder roots, that part is going to absorb more color. And then when you undo the skein, you'll have some patchiness. So as you were knitting with it, it would work up kind of like a variegated skein.
So along with the talk about color, have you noticed um, that colors that don't seem to go together, if you look at a color wheel, maybe go together, those naturally dyed
Mhm.
tend to go better?
I think that is definitely a thing, Karen. I think that, Mother Nature designed these amazing colors out there and there's no mistakes, right? So um, the, they do tend to go together much better than say you picked a light blue from an acid dye and you tried to put it together with the wrong green. I think there's just a lot more of that soft working together with the natural dyes. Um, and I think it's because they're all coming from like the basic chlorophyll type base for the most part.
Do you have a favorite color that you've dyed? Is there one color that you particularly love that's natural dyed over anything you could possibly find acid dyed?
Um, One of my favorites to use is this wild mint that grows all over our farm. It's called Perilla frutuscum, and it's prolific on my property. It's just everywhere. And so I use the same procedure that I use for purple dead nettle, just basic, simmering that plant down and then adding some iron to darken the golden yellows. And it is the darkest green I've ever made. And it made some beautiful garments that I've just loved. It's I wish I had one right here to show you, but it's a really, really pretty dark green. Very complementary color for most people. So that, I think that's my favorite one to work with. It's also a time of year where, you know, you're kind of getting into more of the fallish kind of colors. And so it's a nice one to kind of do your switch over from your blooms from your garden, and it's fun. The other thing that I've been playing around with lately has been the liquid natural dyes that Botanical Colors sells.
Okay.
Those are really fun to play with. And I've recently been coming up with some good color combinations by taking my natural dyes and then just changing them ever so slightly with maybe a half a teaspoon of the liquid dye. So taking the Saxon blue and adding even just a couple drops to a green that isn't really beautiful. And then it just kind of brightens it up and just gives it more life. And it's not something that I need a lot of, you know, so just add, I'm not making a Saxon blue dye pot. I'm just using it to kind of adjust colors.
You've written some other books as well. What other books have you written?
I did. So I've written books on both chicken keeping and goat keeping. And then I wrote this book for Skyhorse Publishing. It's The Good Living Guide to Keeping Sheep and Other Fiber Animals. And it's a combination of animal care, and then what do you do with the fiber now that you've got fiber from your animals. You know, a lot of people don't know, like they're just like, well, just throw it away. I don't knit, or I don't do anything, and I don't spin, and I don't want this fiber, you know. And I was trying to encourage people to learn the entire process. Like, even if you want to jump in at spinning and you want to go buy a fleece from somebody else, I just kind of wanted the book to share and show this whole process of the animal care all the way through the fiber production that animal does and how our caretaking affects that. And then what are you going to do now? There's no need to waste that product. Maybe you don't want it, but somebody might want it.
So where can people find your books?
I have them all available on my website, which is timbercreekfarmer.com. Or they're available in my Etsy shop, and they're available on Amazon.
And there's a photo of your most recent book.
Yes. Yeah, I'll just show the when that screen's done being shown up there, I will just show you what the workbook page in that workbook looks like. So it tells you, it has a place for the name of the dye, what you're using, what kind of yarn you used, or what kind of fiber, because, you know, they're all going to take the dye differently. Merino is going to take it differently than the Romney fiber, or your alpaca is going to come out looking a different shade than your wool. How much you were using, what kind of mordant you used is over here, and then a section for notes. So, you know, you can keep track of that, and then the temperature that you used of the water. I tried to like think of a lot of things that you should just make note of, so that, you know, if you use your dandelions this year and you go back to do it next year, you can look back and just kind of go, oh, wait a minute, I didn't want that, you know, I didn't want that to happen. What did I do differently? So.
Well, that's terrific. Thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you, Karen. I appreciate it.
And we look forward to seeing you next year at the, hopefully.
Yes, hopefully we'll all be back in person.
Yep. Thanks very much.
Thanks.